Right. Hi, AP class. We are starting to talk about water. And this is a topic that I am personally very passionate about, so we should have a lot of fun with it. So the first thing, we're going to talk about water in the context of aquatic ecosystems to start with. So there are some physical gradients that determine what kind of plants and animals tend to live in an area. So the first physical gradient is depth. And the depth of the water will determine the amount of sunlight that can penetrate the water column, and then that will also in turn help determine the temperature. One of the other physical gradients that we will look at is nutrients. So there are some limiting nutrients in freshwater systems, like phosphorus is limiting for plants, and oxygen is limiting for animals. But in a lot of our systems that we have, especially in the U.S. and in developing countries all over the world, wherever there's humans, a lot of our systems have too many nutrients. And so we're now having to look at how to prevent nutrients from getting into systems. And then the third physical gradient that we're going to talk about, or that determines what the ecosystem is and what kind of life it supports, is the speed of the water, the movement of the water. So I'm going to share my screen with you really quickly if my mouse wants to cooperate, which it does not. There we go. Okay. We are going to talk about the specific ecosystems. So there are three types of systems that we're going to talk about in freshwater. So we have, we have lakes, as you can see up here, rivers and streams, and wetlands. So lakes are generally greater than 2 meters deep. They are naturally occurring bodies of fresh water, and they are still. They are not moving. So ecologists typically classify them based on their nutrient levels. So we have oligotrophic lakes, which are nutrient poor, eutrophic lakes, which are nutrient rich, and mesotrophic lakes, which are somewhere in between. So oligotrophic lakes tend to be really deep, and they have blue-colored water, and they are typically fed with glaciers and mountain streams. So they don't bring a whole lot of sediments or living things into the water that would cloud it up. So they have a very low net primary productivity because they don't have many nutrients. So they're not producing a whole lot. There aren't a whole lot of plants growing there. Then we have the opposite, which is eutrophic lakes. Eutrophic lakes tend to be pretty shallow. They tend to have kind of murky water. They tend to have lots of nutrients in them. They're usually fed by streams, and because they have a lot of nutrients, they tend to have pretty high primary productivity, or they have a lot of vegetation. And then we have our in-between lakes, which fall in between the two extremes. Then lakes are then divided up into zones based on the depth and the distance from shore, and each of these zones has a fairly unique set of plants and animals that can live there. So we have the littoral zone, which is right here along the edge, and that's actually sometimes classified as a wetland. It's usually about less than 2 meters deep. It can support rooted vegetation. And so you're going to have a lot of insects living there, or smaller fish who need some shelter, or amphibians who also need to breathe air, need to come out. Then we have the linetic zone, which is out in the middle of the lake, and it's the very top layer. It receives the most sunlight, And so there we're going to find some plankton that can photosynthesize, and we're probably also going to find maybe some fish and maybe some waterfowl. And then in the profundal zone, which is in the middle still, but the next layer down, it receives less sunlight, and we're looking at mostly fish there. And then we have the benthic zone, which is along the bottom of the lake. And so we might find there are lots and lots of little critters that live in sediments of lakes, like bloodworms. There are some, and some other like insect larvae that live down there. And then we have rivers and streams. So those systems are flowing water. It's flowing on the surface, and it has 3 aquatic life zones that you can look at more in the book. On page 148, the source zone, which is where the runoff is being usually generated. It's usually up in the mountains. And then the transition zone, which is where the river is kind of transitioning from source zone to floodplain zone. And then the floodplain zone, which is usually pretty flat. The river takes on more sinuosity or curves and is in contact more with its floodplains. And so this area can actually also be considered a wetland too. So wetlands are very important ecosystems, and they are actually in the Clean Water Act under one of the sections in the Clean Water Act. It's defined as those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances do support, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soils. Wetlands generally include swamps, marshes, bogs, and similar areas. That's a big, crazy, long definition, and you don't need to know it word for word. You do need to know that wetlands must have 3 things to be a wetland. They must have ground that is saturated for most of the growing season. The water needs to be within a foot of the surface for a long enough period of the growing season to support hydrophytic vegetation. So hydrophytic vegetation is vegetation that thrives with its roots being wet, or can survive with its roots being wet. So this ranges from like lily pads and aquatic grasses that must be wet all of the time to trees that can tolerate being wet, like cypress, and actually part of their reproduction requires standing water, but they don't have to be wet all of the time. And then also hydric soils is the third thing that an area must have to be classified as a wetland. So hydric soils are just soils that have developed under saturated conditions. So they have been deprived of oxygen, they have created an anoxic environment at some point in time, and it has characteristics that show that. So like these models in the soil, these little orange areas that come from redox reactions. All right, so those are our 3 systems, and we will talk a little bit more about them in class, and we'll talk more about why they are so valuable. And I'm sure you can probably figure out a lot of the reasons on your own, seeing as we need fresh water to survive, and animals need fresh water to survive. So these ecosystems are not only very interesting places to study with very unique life, but they're also essential to our life because we need the clean water that they provide. All right, so if you can't tell, I'm trying to curb my enthusiasm about aquatic ecosystems, so hopefully this video isn't too long. We'll talk more about them later.